Hello, everybody. My name is Blake Eady, and I'm the moderator for the board for the Gathering of Baptists. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. We're pleased to be able to welcome those of you who have been with us for a long time now, as well as those who are new to the gathering. So on behalf of the Gathering of Baptists, I would like to welcome you to our fall gathering, Being Church in a Post-Pandemic World. We'll now have a video, Pandemic Change, followed by our own Dr. Rita Shelton Deverell, who was recently named Lakehead University's 10th Chancellor, and she'll be leading us in our centering thoughts.
Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt, like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality. Trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world. And ready to fight for it.
Listen. Listen to the words of the prophet Isaiah. The creator of the earth calls out, "All you who are thirsty, come to the water. You that have no money, come buy food and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money, without price. Why spend your money for what is not bread, and your wages for what fails to satisfy? Listen carefully to me, and you will eat well and delight in rich food. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen so that you may live. Seek me while I may be found. Call upon me while I am near. Let the corrupt abandon their ways and the unjust their thoughts. Let them return to me, that I may have mercy on them. Return to me, for I will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain and snow come down from heaven and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it fertile and fruitful, giving seed to the sower and bread for food, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, achieving the end for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. The cypress will grow in place of the thorn bush. The myrtle will replace the briars, and they shall stand as a memorial to our God, an everlasting sign, never to be destroyed. My dear friends, this is the word of God.
Amerikan, där man är på Don Ben. Asian, Européen, där man är på Don Ben. Salut, salam, shalom, salut, salam, shalom. Noir ou blanc, rouge ou jaune. Nie pe bokiem, nie pe jale, nie bom. Nie pe bokiem, nie pe jale, nie sak. Nie pe bokiem, nie pe tomadama.
Freedom, freedom and justice is the melody that let us shine on. If you hear it through the music, we can make this world a better place. Freedom, freedom and justice is the melody that let us shine on. If you feel
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dave Ogilvie, the chair of the program committee for the gathering. And on behalf of our committee, I'd like to welcome all of you to our fall gathering. We are not technical people. I make that confession right up front, but we've got good people doing the best that we can do to make this as smooth and seamless as we possibly can. And we thank you for your patience when things don't go quite according to plan. We are delighted that you have all chosen to spend some time with us today. It may be morning, it may be afternoon, it may be evening when you're watching this, but wherever you are, may you know the presence of God and may you know the joy of our company as well. Good to have you join us. I want to tell you just a little bit about the day, but before I do that, may I just remind you that important Zoom etiquette is to keep your microphone muted at all times, unless you are actually speaking to the group. And just a reminder to please encourage you to monitor your own microphones as best you can and keep them muted unless you are in the midst of a small group experience, or maybe if you are asking a question a little bit later on. In just a moment, I'm going to direct things to Leanne McKenna, who's going to do some introductions of our guest speakers, and we'll hear from Michael Blair and Ken Sehested. As a program committee, we wanted to start today by playing the video that was right up at the front end of our program. The Pandemic is a Portal. It's a portion of a large essay by Arundhati Roy. And it's a wonderful piece of writing that inspired us as a program committee to think about what we might do for this fall program.
Watch this, the portal.
We also see the portal, the pandemic very much as a portal, as a doorway to a new world, a new reality. And how do we be the church on the other side of this portal? And that's what we're going to explore with our guests today. We look forward to
Why would you need to watch it?
Tested. Again, just a reminder to please mute your microphones if you have not already done so. After we've heard from both of our speakers, there'll be a 10-minute break, and we're going to hold you to that very tightly. Then there'll be some opportunity for small group discussion, and then you'll come back from those small groups for some dialogue with our guests. Once again, it promises to be a really meaningful morning. After that, we will close the official program part of the day, but we will then have our annual general meeting for the gathering, and we encourage and invite all of you who are here today to join us for that meeting.
A working group of Baptists.
To get to know a little bit more about us. And once again, may I remind you, please check to make sure that your microphone is muted. Thank you.
We are muted.
I'm going to call on Leanne McKenna, who is a member of our board, to come at this time to introduce the first of our guests for the day. Leanne. See if we can find you in the maze here. That's sometimes easier said than done. Let's see, where are you?
Right here.
You know where you are, don't you? Yeah, we found you. You were there just a moment ago. You're gonna have to spotlight yourself, I think, Leanne. There you are. Gotcha.
Yeah. So I got the best job. I got to have long conversations with two friends of mine. Go back a lot of years. And I'm going to start with Michael. With apologies to each of you, but just know I didn't make any of this up, okay? I first met Michael Blair when he was a speaker at Encounter, a Baptist youth event in 1990 in St. Catharines, Ontario. It was an unforgettable encounter. Born in Jamaica, Michael had several denominational influencers, landing for some years in the Baptist tradition, pastoring several churches. In the early 2000s, Michael had switched gears to social ministry with the United Church, spending some years working in Toronto's Regent Park neighborhood. From there, the UCC, the United Church of Canada, plucked him up, recognizing his skills for leadership. After many years leading the Church and Mission program, Michael completes this very Monday, his first year as the General Secretary of the National United Church of Canada. In August 2020, Michael's Facebook page filled up with a combination of riotous congratulations on his appointment and suitable emojis and puzzlement. Are you out of your ever-loving mind? And what a year it has been. Some of you may have been at the gathering at Calvary Baptist in Toronto in 2013 when Michael accepted an invitation by his former tribe to update us on him and his work with the United Church of Canada. He shared his concerns about the future of the UCC and his dreams for a future that is not just tweaked, but thoroughly re-envisioned. In a single year, that vision is already taking place. Baptist life shaped Michael as a pastor, but particularly during his years with Build. How many of us remember Build, which has kept an eye on congregational life's necessary engagement with the world. As program lead for Church and Mission, the field expanded to a global perspective. So administration, not exactly turning his crank, but he is keenly aware of how his heritage, his history, informs his work as General Secretary. He sees himself as a lighthouse, shining the light so that people can navigate the shoals of church life. The lighthouse, after all, has seen it all, understands the terrain, sharpening vision. That vision is being clarified in a wide-ranging harvesting of input from across the country, which has just this past weekend been approved. The work is already underway, putting wheels under deep spirituality, bold leadership, and daring justice, a creative reworking of the hermeneutical circle of action, reflection, action. The key objectives reflect priorities that cross global boundaries: earth, climate, commitment, racism, Indigenous relationships, a focus on the suffering of LGBTQ+ communities around the world. The revealing, he noted, of thousands of graves of Indigenous children buried unmarked in the soils of former residential schools has sharpened questions of, so why church? What church? Why would I want to be a part of such a thing? For the UCC and beyond, what does it mean to disrupt the narrative of decline and begin to define things differently? Change is already happening from the local church level as permission is given to reimagine leadership and membership and property, a greater focus on providing the supports that small rural churches need. The face of the United Church of Canada has changed literally and figuratively, reflecting the diversity of this country and of UCC churches. The impact of a strong rudder, that would be Michael, guiding a newly drawn map is making a difference. Michael tells me that he has recently been appointed as the next moderator of the World Council of Churches Commission on World Mission and Evangelism. He said, sometimes I think I'm too old for this. It feels as if doors are opening during these older years rather than in my younger years. Though Michael is now at the summit of the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, way ahead of the curve on all those things the gathering cares about: Indigenous rights and relations, LGBTQ+, Palestine, Israel, climate change, and a just economy for all. I think there's still a big chunk of Baptist in him, still ours. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Leanne. Appreciate that. I was a little bit scared about what you were going to say, but I'm appreciative.
Oh, well, I hope that was okay.
I was just in a conversation with one of my staff colleagues who is also introducing me tonight at a service I'm preaching at, and her word to me was to be anxious. So I was a little bit anxious, but I'm grateful. Friends, it's good to be with you, and it's good to be with people who are part of my tribe in many ways. And this afternoon, as we kind of reflect on being church in a post-pandemic world, one of the things I want to do is just to kind of help us think again about what the pandemic has revealed about us as a church and what are some of the challenges that faces. I do so from a perspective of being the national leader of a significant denomination here in Canada, but also with an eye of recognizing the kind of church and Christian landscape that I have experienced it sitting in the role that I am. As we gather this afternoon, I want to acknowledge that we gather on territorial heritage of many Indigenous nations. The place I'm at this afternoon has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation and the Mississaugas. And now it's the home to many Indigenous people. I want to pay respect to the peoples of this land and offer my gratitude for their stewardship, resilience in the face of genocide, and their generosity in continuing to offer friendship and hospitality. Given the reality of the need for reconciliation and reparation, I acknowledge that I'm committed to a journey of listening, learning, and working towards justice and reconciliation. As we begin this afternoon, I want to just read a few verses from Jeremiah chapter 29, a text which I think is probably very familiar to us. Jeremiah chapter 9, beginning at verse 4. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the exile whom I've sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there, and do not decrease. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. When I read this text and I put it in the larger context of what God has done through and with the people of Israel, I'm reminded again that we need to find ways to frame what we have experienced in this pandemic. And one of the things that I'm reminded of is that we are not the first generation to have gone through a situation that not only systemically, but seismically changed the face of how we are and how we experience the world. And the thing which gives me hope and the thing which I'm going to try and push us towards this afternoon is the recognition that God is up to something. And the people of Israel need to be reminded in the midst of the absolute devastation and loss that they experienced due to the Babylonian captivity, that it wasn't over. God wasn't finished, and that God had a purpose. And this afternoon, I want to hopefully kind of just nudge us or sharpen our imagination a little bit about what God may have in store for us as the people of God in this particular time of our life and history. I think the pandemic has disrupted our understanding of what it means to be church and what it means to be community. It's disrupted our understanding of our social networks and our notion of family. And I want to, as I nudge and kind of sense what God is up to, also push us into this place that we need to live into the disruption that we've experienced. So the pandemic has been, in my mind, a great revealer. And in that way, not to diminish the reality of the fact that it's been a painful time in the number of lives that have been lost, and the fact that the economy has been significantly disrupted. I also want to say that this pandemic period has been a gift. And the gift has been in what it has revealed to us. And so I want to just highlight a few of the things that I think the pandemic has revealed, particularly in the Canadian context, with the aim of, as I say, to kind of nudge us to ask the question, so what is God up to? And what is God nudging us into as a church? I think one of the first things that for me that this pandemic has done is to reinforce my appreciation and understanding of the secularity of the context in which we find ourselves. We have known for quite a long time that the Canadian context is increasingly a secular context. And what was interesting in the process of the pandemic for me was that the systems, the political systems, didn't know what to do with us as religious communities. In fact, the initial thing was they saw us as totally useless, right? If you remember in the early days, and even in some ways, that the understanding that we may have shaped our imagination with around being present and offering pastoral care to people who are in crisis, as people are dying. Much of our experience as ministers have been present with families as they've lost loved one, being able to commit a loved one. And in this time when there was so much death and grief, the system said we were unessential and useless. And part of the question I think we have to struggle with in that, and I know there were a number of different groups who were fighting to be identified as being essential, and I want to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But I think at the core of it is this notion that we are seeing what we understand our ministry to be is something that's not seen and valued in the secular society that we live in. And one of the questions I think we have to face in this is, how did we get here? How did we get here, right? Because in some ways, the other side of that coin for me is that the government, the system understood that we contributed to people's unwillingness to get vaccinated. And so when they wanted to roll out a mandatory vaccine or try to get vaccination across, they called us together to say, you need to help us to make sure people are getting their vaccines. But the critical piece of our ability to walk with and care with people who were suffering and dying and in pain, the government said, you were useless. And so there was no place for you. And so I think it's one of the questions for us is, how did we get to this place where what we value is no longer valued by the society? And I think that revelation for me is something that is significant for us to think about. And I'll try and come back to offer, I think, something around that. The second thing that this pandemic has demonstrated is the reality of racism, systemic racism in our culture. And by the reality that it's in our culture, it's also in the context of our communities of faith. And in some ways, it's not, I think it's really telling that the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent transitions that happen in the society happened within the context of the pandemic, because it was that moment of this kind of great revelation. And part of the revelation is that there is systemic racism, and in particular, anti-Black racism that is rampant in our culture, and I would say in our communities of faith. The hurtful thing, I think, in this pandemic season around the issue of the reality of racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, has been the silence of the church in not speaking to, I think there are three things the church has not done in this period of time. It has not lamented its contribution to systemic racism. It seems to think that it's somebody else's problem. And in fact, one of the part of the issue that has led to this, I think, lack of lamenting the reality of racism in our society and in our communities of faith is that we have somehow convinced ourselves that our commitment to multiculturalism has been a solution to what we see as it's out there in the world and it's not in here in the context of our faith communities. Let me just kind of push that a little bit. You know, it's been interesting, and I have a bunch of friends that I've hung around with for years. And one of the questions I'm asking them is that in all the years that you have engaged in ministry, how many Black folks have you mentored or nurtured into leadership? And the reality is that when I look at the whole issue of the Black church in Canada, many of us don't have any clue around the contribution of the Black church. Of us see Black folks as like you and not see Black folks as having a history and challenges and the need to attend to those. And in many ways, you know, folks, let me just pause and breathe a little bit and say, you know, it's disheartening for me that in this time in the life of Canada, that among mainline denominations, I'm the only Black senior leader in any denomination here in Canada. It breaks my heart often when I'm in places and I don't see anybody that looks like me. And yet I realize that I've been nurtured by the church here in some ways, but there hasn't been a sense of recognition of the need to move people into leadership. So I think there's been a lack of lament in the life of the churches. We haven't said that. I think the second thing is that we have not been willing to ask for forgiveness for the ways in which we have contributed to systemic racism in the society. If you remember, folks, that a lot of the independent Black churches started because white folks didn't want those people among them. And the way in which we treat people of African descent has been a way in which we have contributed to even some of the values of society. You know, you remember the days when many of our churches were adamantly against interracial marriages. And so I think it's important, we need to offer forgiveness. So we need to repent and we need to offer forgiveness. And we need to speak the truth. We need to begin to discover ways in which we will be able to say, we want to learn to do better at this than we have done before. And I just grieve the silence of the church in the midst of this particular time of unveiling and the unveiling of the reality of racism and in particular anti-Black racism. I also lament the fact that the church has not come alongside of the Black Lives Matter initiatives. And that we take pride in debating the issue of doesn't all lives matter? without giving attention to the particularities of certain communities' experience. And so the silence has been deafening in the context of this time of pandemic. The other piece around this is particularly around with the Indigenous communities, that the unveiling or the discovery, it's hard to tell whether it's a discovery because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had already pointed to the fact that there are over 6,000 children who were missing and are probably laying in unmarked graves in different places across the country. But again, the silence of our churches around this horrific issue of what is happening with the Indigenous communities and the grief and sorrow that is happening in the lives of the Indigenous communities as they are dealing with the fact that their ancestors were taken away from them. And the fact that many of our churches did not engage in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many of our churches know nothing of the 94 calls that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this kind of lack of engagement with the kind of the sense of the marginalized and the people who have been beaten down by values that we have upheld, and the silencing of that in this particular time is indeed troubling. And I think it's one of the issues that has been surfaced in this pandemic time. Our unwillingness to deal with the trauma and the legacy of colonialism on the lives of Black bodies and red bodies, and the silencing of that, I think is part of the challenge we face. And I think our future, I think where God's calling us to as communities of faith is how will we engage in that trauma and the healing that needs to come out of this particular time. The third thing I think the pandemic has done for us is it's revealed the lack of equity, and it has also revealed the crack within the local and global society. We know in particular that the reality that people lost their livelihood overnight, the reality that a small group of us in the global north have vaccines. We've had 2 doses, and some of us are about to have a 3rd dose. And there are many communities in the global south that still haven't gotten their 1st dose. And we know that healing isn't going to come unless these countries in the global south have access to the vaccine. And yet, my friends, the church has been silent. The church has not been at the forefront of advocating with our governments and our political system for a fair and just and equitable distribution of the resources that are available to us. I think it's also demonstrated in the fact that many of us are silent about the issue of a guaranteed livable income for Canadians. One of the things that I think this pandemic has demonstrated again is the need for equitable distribution of the wealth and the resources in our society. And again, the church has been silent around engaging with a guaranteed livable income, because again, part of the perspective, and I'll come to that. I think the other thing around the lack of equity and the crack within the local and social, I live in Toronto. I'm not there today, but I live in Toronto. And one of the things that I've appreciated about the city of Toronto, as they've tried to address the issue of vaccines, is that they recognized that there was no need, a one size fits all would not work for people in the city of Toronto. And so they had to recognize that people of African descent, people from Asia, people from Latin America, the different groups in the society needed a unique approach that was consistent with who they are to be able to help them to engage with a vaccine. And again, one of the challenges for us in our church communities is that we tend to see everybody the same. And our theology, which says, you know, and some of you may have heard me say this, I have when I first came to Canada, I had some friends who said to me, oh, you know, Mike, we don't see you as Black, we see you like one of us. And initially I thought, oh dear Jesus. But the reality was that even in saying that, they completely negated everything about me that made me me, because the skin I live in shapes who I am, right? And in some ways, when we see the variety of people in our pews and think we're all alike because, quote unquote, we love Jesus, and not see how our life and lived experience has shaped us, we are in trouble. And I think it's important to recognize that in this particular time, and the gift of the unveiling in this COVID time is that it has demonstrated to us the cracks and the importance for us to address the cracks as people of faith. Fourth thing, and I'll hurry here. I have eight things that I wanted to say, and I'm just halfway through. But the fourth thing is about our property and finances. As the United Church of Canada, you know, we have well over almost 3,000 congregations across the country, and all of those congregations have property of some sort. One of the things that we discovered in this pandemic was that many of our congregations were only surviving because they could rent their buildings out. And the recognition for us, it was alarming for us to recognize how close to being not able to survive our congregations were, because they were dependent on rent. And as everything shut down and they couldn't rent their properties, they were in trouble. We had to act quite quickly to try and make available resources to our communities of faith to be able to kind of weather the time. But it made us recognize this need for us to be attentive to the reality of how our properties get used and what we do with them. But the second thing around that is finances. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has demonstrated to us is that we have to begin to rethink how it is that we fund the ministries that we are engaged in. The recognition that a funding model that's based on the pew will be problematic, right? And what was interesting to me is that the outcry of people wanting to get back to church was more about finances than anything, because there was this recognition that if the congregation didn't gather, people wouldn't be able to contribute. I must say, as an aside, we in the United Church were lucky in that for a number of years, we have what's called PAR. It's an opportunity. We have a system that we support across the country for congregations to have members who are contributing to the church give automatically from their bank account. And so that's been set up by a number of our majority of our congregations. And that was a real gift to our congregations because income kept coming in. The other issue that this has been unveiled to us at this particular time is around technology. And the issue, and we've demonstrated this afternoon, the challenge of managing technology. But here's the thing, folks. Sometimes we've critiqued technology and it's hard for us to shift. But I think one of the challenges for us in this time and going into the future is how we use technology. And technology is here to stay. And one of the challenges with that, I think that the COVID has demonstrated to us, is that we have this tendency to not pause and give thought to what it is that the context and the tools for the context to do our work. Many of us has simply shifted what we do on Sunday mornings in the building onto Zoom or whatever platform we're using. But what we don't understand is that the platform requires a different sense of imagination in terms of how to use it to engage our society. And so that's critical. I think the sixth thing I want to say is that the pandemic has demonstrated to us the challenge around leadership. That we have trained people for ministry leadership for a church that has not existed since 1960. And we continue to train people for a church that doesn't exist. And it's maddening when we continue to do that because, you know, in the early days of pandemic, for us in the United Church as an example, in the early days of the pandemic, a number of our ministers retired. And they basically said, I don't know how to do this. I was never trained in it. Our ministers who have stayed in the fray are exhausted. They are tired. They don't know where to begin, right? It's such a huge shift. But part of it is that one, we don't know how to resource them, and we haven't trained them to work in this environment. I think the other thing to say in the Canadian context is that the pandemic has demonstrated how the fractures that exist within the Christian communities in this country. And part of that fracture is that we are no longer our theologies have gotten in the way of the mission and ministry that God has given to us. And if anything, the pandemic has said to us is that, look, we've got to re-hear and reimagine the mission and ministry that God has called us to do as the people of God in this time and in this place. And we've got to find ways to not let our theologies and our practice get in the way of us being the people of God. And finally, sorry, no, my time's almost up, 2 minutes. I think one of the challenges of this particular time is that it has demonstrated the weakness of our capacity to do theological reflection. We need to be thinking about our ecclesiology, and we're not. We're all struggling for survival, and we're not thinking about the kind of ecclesiology that we need to a robust ecclesiology. It's, coming out of some work that the Methodists and the Anglicans did in the UK was a statement which I continue to lift up. And the statement is this: it's not that the Church of God has a mission in the world, but that the God of mission has a church in the world. It's not that the church has a mission in the world, it's that God has a mission in the world. And I think in this particular time, we need a robust engagement around our ecclesiology to understand what it means to be engaged with a God who has a mission in the world and a God who is committed to a transformation and a healing of the trauma and the brokenness of the lives that are part of our life experience in the world. But we haven't thought about that. I think we need to rethink what we understand about community. And we need to revisit the notion of the communion of all saints. And might there be a kernel in the notion of the communion of all saints that would enable us to think about what a community looks like in a virtual space? Friends, I think our future is not in person. We will have some hybrid, but our future is going to be very much rooted in a virtual kind of space. And we've got to think about, what does community look like in that virtual space, right? We're all longing for touch and feel and being together and singing. And, and I think, excuse me, would you want to be in a church, in a mass, where you can't sing, when you can stay at home, join a worship service and sing to your heart's content? So, friends, I think we need some conversation, and it's not a individual, denominational conversation. It's a conversation between those of us who own our understanding of being the people of God. I think we need to think ethically. One of the things I think this time calls for us is some ethical thinking, and particularly around the issues of the vaccine and mandatory vaccination, and the question of, as many of our churches the churches that I represent are struggling with, about the fact that the passports are mandatory for people to come to worship as they open up. I think we need some ethical conversation. What's going on, right? But we have become lazy in our theologizing and in our thinking. And I think this moment calls us to be doing some robust thinking about our ecclesiology, our understanding of community, and our understanding of ethics. And the other piece that I think this moment calls us to is a call to advocacy. If we are the instruments of the God of mission in this world, then we cannot be silent to the economic injustice. We can't be silent to the racial injustice. We can't be silent to the trauma that Indigenous people are experiencing. It's not, friends, about us. So much of the diatribe that I experience around Christian communities is about our own survival. And friends, that's not on. I think this pandemic has reminded us that we have a call to be God's presence in the world, and to be able to communicate to people that God has not abandoned them. That we're called to build houses. We're called to live in this place. We're called to be people who seek the welfare of the places where God has placed us. We don't have a choice, friends. We don't have a choice. And if we're silent about the things that impact the lives of people, that God help us. And finally, we need to be people who are discerning the presence of God among us and what God is up to. So the pandemic is a gift. Pandemic is a reminder, and the pandemic is an invitation to rediscover our call as the people of God in this time and in this place. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. Ken, I hope you're not shivering in your boots right now. Thank you so much, Michael. So the conference, the gathering poster introduces Ken as a biblical scholar. He says he'd quibble a bit with the scholar part. I'm not sure about that. Prophetic writer, pastor, reformed, traveling evangelist, and a one-time footballer. It says it all right there. A life punctuated by two particularly stellar achievements, the founding of the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America and the more recent owner-operator of the online theological brilliance that is Prayer and Politics. He didn't mention gas jockey and stonemason, both of which have also contributed their stories. In his early years, football and Ken were indistinguishable, one from the other, with a skill impressive enough to win him 3 full scholarship invitations. Yet at the end of his first semester at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, Ken resigned from both the team and the scholarship. That and what followed was what he describes even today as the most difficult thing he's ever had to do. He was a hometown star. The Schneider Daily News published his rising star story detailing Ken's plans for his life. 4 years at Baylor, some football, major in religion, go to Southwestern Seminary, play some football, and eventually replace Billy Graham when he decided to call it quits. As Christmas and his return home approached, he had a recurring nightmare that his hometown barber would use his straight razor on him when Ken told him what he'd done. Nothing worse than a quitter where he came from. The Southern Baptists employed him as a summer missionary in a church on Long Island, New York. There, the God question started. Returning to Baylor, the sharp edges of those questions persisted, and he returned to New York, eventually enrolling at Union Seminary, a school renowned for allowing, encouraging theological kicking and screaming, praying while throwing things. He had good formation, learning from and mentored by the likes of James Coyne, Dorothee Sölle, Gustavo Gutierrez, Robert Handy, Will Campbell, and James McClendon. The latter called himself a small B Baptist. Ken liked that. Loyalty not to an institution, but to a set of impulses that were unleashed in history by the early dissenting Baptists. Unique gifts of the Spirit imparted in the midst of that movement, much of which has been lost to Baptists while being picked up by the larger church. In 1984, Ken founded the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America. If you haven't yet experienced that movement, you need to do so, bpfna.org. Many of us were together in that side room at the BCOQ assembly many years ago, offering a different voice, when John Furry said this: "The BPFNA has certainly kept me Baptist. It is quite possible that it has kept me Christian." Many have said that, actually, Ken affirms. My family's first BPFNA Peace Camp in 1989 was a hinge moment in my life, introducing me to Ken and Nancy Sehested and the BPFNA, taking me off to places unimagined, geographic and theological. It nurtured and continues to nurture my life as an activist, preacher, educator, and writer. The traveling evangelist part of Ken shifted shape in the founding of Prayer and Politics, a compendium of riches, artwork, poetry, prayers, preaching, and liturgy. Whether you are a preacher or not, take a regular stroll through Prayer and Politics. Though he viewed his youthful summers as an itinerant preacher with some ambivalence, the early and the later Ken found themselves indeed, perhaps surprisingly, part of a single story, still a traveler virtually, and still an evangelist. Welcome, Ken. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Leanne. You actually got my introductory comment started already. My ship of faith has many sails, but my main sail flows from those dissident Protestants in Europe who became known as the Anabaptists, partly because their understanding of the Reformation's insistence on faith alone was okay, but not sufficient. The Anabaptists insisted on using the word following Jesus rather than believing in Jesus. In fact, they used the German word Nachfolge, which later was actually the original German title of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship. Though my spiritual vision has been fed from many wells, I do think there are Baptist impulses which need constantly nurturing, particularly the work of democratizing access to the holy. One of my personal saints is Roger Williams, founders of the First Baptist Congregation in North America. You may know that he was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635. The first of 4 charges against him was explicitly political, because Williams insisted, and I quote, that we have not our land by patent from the king, but that the natives are the true owners of it, and that we ought to repent of such a receiving of it by patent. And speaking of saints, tonight, as you know, begins an important trifecta of liturgical moments. Tonight's All Hallows Eve, tomorrow's All Saints Day, and for the really earnest crowd, All Souls Day on Monday. My hunch is that All Saints Day may be the most important liturgical moment in need of recovery. Remembrance of those gone before us provides the buoyancy to continue the struggle despite bleak prospects. Such stories perform vivid reminders that A, we are not the first to encounter hard times, and B, the assurance that sustenance beyond our own ingenuity will be provided. Hallowing is the harbinger of death's demise and joy's full embrace. Hallowing is the asset that sustains us, wounded but poised and resolute in the face of history's brutal affront. Speaking of bleak prospects and history's brutal affront, that's one way of wording our topic for this gathering. Being the church in a post-pandemic world, what has been uncovered and what are we called to do? In an earlier phone call with Leanne, she used the word stupor to describe her life in the last year and a half. Normally traveling a lot in her work, when the pandemic hit, she decided, well, this might be a good time to write that book I've been thinking about. But the pandemic's immobilizing effect on our interactions had a similar effect on our emotions and spirit. Stupor is a good word, and it needs to be admitted. As with all grievous emotions, when stupor comes knocking on your door, it does no good to ignore it. You need to let it in and say, you're welcomed, stay as long as you need, but you'll get neither bed nor board in this house. Michael has done a remarkable job speaking both about the fault lines and the possibilities of this pandemic and what has been overcome, particularly in this stupefying season. I'll begin where he left off with my current favorite quote from the poet Adrienne Marie Brown. Things are not getting worse. Things are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. But first, let's consider our text for today from Isaiah 55. In particular, we need to pay attention to the social location of those to whom this powerful poetry was spoken. Our respective cultures have a tendency to romanticize the opening statements, urging the thirsty, come to the waters and imbibe wine, milk, and bread at no charge. It would make a good Hallmark card dripping with sentiment. But notice that God, through the prophet's mouth, begins by addressing the mechanisms of commerce. The hearers in this speech are the Israelites who were taken into custody in the 6th century when Babylon wrested control of Judea. The ones marched off into exile were no doubt ingrained into Babylonian society. They were the social, religious, and political elite, and they had come to learn to play by Babylon's extractive and consumptive rules. They had become acclimated. They had forgotten the old covenant of neighborliness and sharing first laid out at Mount Sinai after their escape from Egypt's brickyards. Their sensibilities to the distinctive rule of Yahweh had dulled. The imperative stated in verse 2, listen, is like the sound of a cracking whip. Listen, the text insists, you must learn to eat differently. The word of the Lord always and everywhere includes earthly affairs relating to the distribution of food. And distinctive faith, especially in the manner of Jesus, always resists the dominant economy. In verses 6 through 9, the poet recites what is today a common call to worship in many congregations. It begins with, seek the Lord where he may be found, call upon him while he is near. But then in a second crack of the whip, we hear, let the wicked forsake their ways, the unrighteous, those who practice an economy of scarcity and rationing, an economy in direct competition with Yahweh's manna economy. You that have no money, come, buy and eat, the poet writes. As Walter Brueggemann put it, in this exile community is being called to sanity in an insane context. Remember who you are. Every Eucharist, every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper is done in remembrance of our baptismal vows, remembrance of Jesus' promise to be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world, remembrance of the rainbow promise where God vowed to disarm heaven itself, remembrance of the joy and delight God expressed at the end of creation. The English translation in Genesis records this assessment from God as this: it is good, but that word is far too tame. What God said was more like Teve, the milkman in Fiddler on the Roof, when he broke out in song and dance, or Anthony Quinn as Zorba the Greek with his wild gyrations in rhythm to that film's iconic music. As it stands now, dancing and singing are a long way from our daily experience. This is a hard time for us all, particularly since the pandemic is not yet post and continues to bedevil much of what we want to do, particularly in the churches. Speaking at a conference some years ago, my wife, Nancy, noted that as a pastor, she sometimes felt like a midwife bringing something to life, and sometimes like a hospice chaplain accompanying the dying. On alternate days, maybe you feel that way too. Church affiliation, both in Canada and the US, is dramatically dropping. Our filled sanctuaries and expanding church budgets are a faded memory. We do well to hang on to what we have. It's important to remember, as the poet said, that things are not getting worse, they are getting uncovered. You will be deeply disappointed if you expected I would come to you with 7 steps to revitalizing and expanding your congregation. No such steps exist. Chances are our tribe will be getting smaller. Maybe, like Gideon's army in the book of Judges, we will have to trim our numbers in order to get into the shape for the demands of our mission. I do so wish I had a formula for you. But here are some things that I know. I know that vital worship comes from having concrete connections with the disenfranchised. Risk and reverence go together. And that in worship, we recalibrate our vision and are reanimated to act justly in a world which has lost its mind. I know we need to hold each other tight, sustaining networks like the Gathering of Baptists to encourage and inspire and inform each other. And I urge you to do the work needed to maintain and expand the pastoral benefits that come from these relationships. I know that the contours of discipleship, Nachfolge, play out in material terms. The rule of mammon, money, power, influence, is the chief rival to God's rule. I know that God is more taken with the agony of the earth than with the ecstasy of heaven. I know there is no getting right with God. There's only getting soaked. I know that we have a distinctive witness to bear, and if we perform it faithfully, chances are sometime we will get in trouble. I know that joy, not moral heroism, is the grounding center of our lives. The most significant change in my theological understanding over the course of my life began a couple of decades ago when I began to sense that joy, a beatific vision, is immeasurably more important than moral heroism. You may be saying, wait, what? Making the leap from stupor to joy is one hell of a leap. But let's stay with me for a few more minutes. For years, I gravitated toward an understanding of discipleship as grit, as something you work hard at accomplishing, of highlighting the need for valor and determination and stamina. Over time, though, life will repeatedly knock you off your feet. I would get back up and keep swinging, but finally it wore me down. And I realized if I were to survive, if I was to find a persevering tempo, I needed a different center from which to work. That spiritual quest led me to joy as the key ingredient for enduring over the long haul. A beatific vision, a heart geared toward beauty rather than heroism, is what is needed. It is what Dr. King spoke of when he talked about the beloved community. And as the writer of Hebrews frames it, it was, quote, for the sake of joy that was set before him, that Jesus endured the cross. It's hard to talk about joy without bringing up images like winning the lottery, or finding a parking space in a crowded downtown, or getting your homemade pie crust just right. Joy is deeper than happiness. Joy is wider than optimism. Joy is higher than mirth. Joy is the deep confidence that we are being held by a lover who will not, under any circumstances, let us go. The confidence that we are profoundly cherished by the one who shaped heaven and earth is what eclipses the fear that we are on our own. Such fearlessness is what sets us free to live with extravagance, with abandon for the sake of the beloved community. Joy creates the capacity to admit sorrow's embrace without being crushed by it. Joy sustains, even in stupor. The 8th century Sufi mystic Rabia uses the word beauty, where I would use the word joy in her prayer to Allah. She wrote, if I adore you out of fear of hell, put me in hell. If I adore you out of desire for paradise, lock me out of paradise. But if I adore you alone, do not deny to me your eternal beauty. I know of 2 ways to nurture the kind of joy that provides sustaining hope. One is to have sustaining, meaningful connection with those who live at the margin, because that's the place where you will find the most hopeful people. The second is to regularly keep the stories of the saints alive in our communities. Finally, let me close with this prayer poem, which I've titled Lamentation to Adulation. Blessed One, whose name we dare not speak, but of whose presence we dare not be silent, we stand before you with hearts in shreds and hands frozen. We know that we are creatures made for praise and thanksgiving. We recognize that gratitude is our natural home. But these are unnatural days. Instead of heaven's jubilation at creation's unfolding, most of what we hear are the arias of agony and the cornets sounding of retreat. Sighs hover, cries haunt, and your face eludes. Such is our distress. Our minds have forgotten the lyrics of assurance, our hearts the melody of steadfast ardor. From all that we can see, joy has crashed against the shoals of sorrow. In our wavering confidence, just short of throwing in the towel, to be rid of all aspirations for your beloved community, all we know to do is prostrate ourselves to petition your long-suffering gaze for renewed vigor and purpose and courage. Remind us again, O Holy Spirit, of that design by whose pattern we were made. Call us back to memory, sweet Jesus, at whose table we eat and drink, of whose feet we are called to watch. Call us back to our right mind for clarity over the source and aim of our commission. From the captivity of silence, give us speech. From our waywardness, guide us back onto the way. Grant the needed armor to withstand the deceiver's assault. Restore sight to fading eyes, strength to feeble needs. Lift our bodies from the slow of failed dreams, broken vows, and sullied virtue. Let the morning sun again rejoice, even when shrouded in cloud. Let every evening's dark descent be occasion for rest rather than fright. Adorn us again with the expectations of hope, of might's manifestation in mercy, of the crowning of peace by the coronation of justice. Open again heaven's portal of adoration, echoed in earth's just flourishing. Gracious One, grant us the wherewithal to journey from Mary's annunciation to Advent's expectation, to Epiphany's acclamation, through lament's interrogation, all the way to Easter's exaltation. And may our ordinary days be marked both by sweat and praise, and find us faithful in the ordinary work of clearing, plowing, planting, that we might winnow the grains of justice and reap the harvest of peace. Now, forever, world without end. Amen.
I don't feel like I should say very much after that, but that we should allow it to simply sink into our souls for a time. Ken, thank you. And Michael, thank you. Thank you for prompting us to think, to reflect, to grieve, to lament, and hopefully to learn and to grow as well. We need a little bit of time just to stretch our legs and refresh ourselves. We've promised that we'll give ourselves 10 minutes and I'm going to hold you to it. So according to my clock right now, we are 2 minutes ahead of ourselves. That's amazing. That never happens when we get together. I have 1:53 in Eastern time. So we will take a 10-minute break, and at 2:03, we will reconvene. And I look forward to seeing all of you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm getting the signal from Leanne and from others here that it's time. As promised, we are back. Both Michael and Ken have raised so many important points of discussion for us that we wanted to give people an opportunity in a small group setting to have some conversation. So in a moment, at the stroke of a key here, I'm going to send you off into small groups together. Each group has been assigned a facilitator. They know who they are. They also have questions for your discussion to kind of get the ball rolling. And so I would suggest, facilitators, that you introduce yourselves when you find yourselves in your breakout rooms, and then maybe get other people to introduce themselves before you dive into the questions. In case you've misplaced those questions, I put them in the chat at the bottom of the screen as well. Have some meaningful and fruitful conversations together, and I will see you back here in 20 minutes time. You'll get a 2-minute warning on your screen just before you head back. We'll see you soon. It always amazes me how everyone just reappears again. You all disappeared, and there you are once again. I'm just going to pause for just a moment while we're sure that make sure that everyone has returned. I think so. There we go. Looks pretty good. When we started doing our gatherings on Zoom, we didn't have a clue what we were doing, and we have just a little bit of a clue now. Part of what we've learned is how to do these breakout rooms, and we've wanted very much to have an opportunity to offer these, because for many of us, the most important part of any gathering is those little side conversations that we get to have with one another around lunch or in the hallway. It's great to listen to speakers, but we want to be able to talk as well. So hopefully you had some robust and meaningful conversation in your small groups. I'm going to call on Karen Turner from our program committee at this time to lead us in some conversation. And I'm hoping that some of you will want to contribute to this conversation out of those conversations that you had in your small group.
Thank you, David. I am going to
You're muted.
Am I still muted?
No, you're good.
Okay, I keep unmuting. So here's the rules for this time of dialogue and questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I'm going to tell you how to do that in a second. But if you have a comment, could you please put it in the chat? Because you've probably all noticed that sometimes when people make comments, they get a little carried away. And so we want to keep the time valuable. We've got about a half an hour here. So comments go in the chat. Questions, you raise your hand and then you can ask your question. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. So for those of you who don't know how to raise your hand, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon that's labeled reactions. And if you click on that, you will see at a square, and at the bottom, there's a bar and it says raise hand. So if you click on that, a little yellow hand will show up in your box that I can see, and then I can call on you. And then after your question, you have to click that same bar. It will say lower hand. So then you put your hand down. So 15 seconds practice. Everybody practice putting your hand up and putting it down. Okay, everybody seems to be getting it. This is wonderful. Okay. Now, if you when I call on you, I'm going to have to depend on your name under your screen. I noticed my name is Kelvin on my screen. That is not true. And I normally know how to rename myself, but this isn't happening. So anyway, I'm going to put this on gallery so I can see everybody. And I am going to open it up to questions. And while you are thinking of your question, I have come up with one to start us off. Because both Michael and Ken made reference to the fact that we are not going to return to normal. The church that we've known is not going to be the church that we're going to experience going forward. Michael talked about the beloved community. The church is the beloved community. And Ken kept referring to the need to hold each other tight. So I would really like both Ken and Michael to reflect for just a minute on what you imagine a local Christian community could look like if they were able to really get a sense of following Jesus rather than the survival mode that Michael referred to, that churches tend to get into survival mode rather than focusing on the need for the beloved community. So I would really like both of your thoughts on what a local Christian community could look like going forward. Michael, do you want to start?
I'm going to invite Ken to start.
Okay.
Okay.
We will learn many things about how to communicate virtually. It will assist us, particularly in some of our national and international conversations. It makes it easier for people to gather. And we will use it as necessary in local settings. The necessity to be rooted in a geographically specific, concrete group of people is essential. For those who say, I can just do without that, and that, churches or organizations sometimes go off their rails, I think that complaint is a little like complaining about the fact that shit stinks. Of course, our organizations will have a tendency to wobble, but finding all the various ways to connect with the local community and then grow arms from those to other local communities, regional communities, national, international communities. We all need all of those, but the one at the local level is what keeps us grounded, I'm convinced.
Yeah, I'd say some of that, probably my starting point would be to say that I'm not quite sure what it looks like, because I think we're in the season of discerning. And part of that discerning is to say, it's an old concept we used to play around with a long time ago, is where is God at work? I think a local community has to start from a starting point of God's at work in our midst or around us. And so where is God at work? And to find the opportunities to join with what God's doing in our communities and larger and onto the global thing. So I think in some ways it's a reorientation of our perspective. The starting point is that we are people who are constantly seeking to discern, and part of that discernment means that we have to be in relationship, not just with our little club, but I think the community of faith are people who are out building relationship with the communities that they live in and amongst. And I think as they build those relationships, it will become clearer and clearer how they may partner with what God's doing in those communities. And it's you know, a friend of mine talks about the book, The Box and the Preacher. I think that model is on its way out. And I think the third thing I would say is and this is part of the work I think we have to do about kind of reimagining our understanding what community means. I think connection is important, but we reinforce this notion that we have to be physically together for community to be real. And I think we're going to have to figure out how, you know, part of my experience and my role. So, you know, for about 6 or 7 months at the start of the pandemic, every other Monday morning at 5:30, I was up in conversation with a group of young men from the Philippines, from Thailand, from Hong Kong, from Indonesia, and we formed community. A few of those folks I had met personally previously, but majority of those folks I hadn't met personally. But for 6 months, you know, every other Monday morning, you know, 5:30 in the evening, Asia time, and 5:30 my morning, I was in community with these folks, and the kind of, even though it was online, the depth of sharing that happened, you know. So I think that's part of it for us, and but connected relationships, discernment, and I think we have lost the art of discernment as Christian communities.
Thank you. So I don't see any hands up. There must be folks with burning questions. Please share them with us. Paul Dakar, knew I could count on you.
Well, thank you, both Ken and Michael, who I remember from your Baptist manifestation long ago. And I've been pondering this call for community and the structural impediment. A book that shaped my thinking 30 years ago was called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And we are so individualistic. We may be part of congregations, but largely we have lost our way in terms of how we can build social movements that will address these massive crises that exist. I'm not sure if I'm really more asking a question, but how do we overcome our tendency, even if we are part of congregations or groups, to be bowling alone?
Michael, why don't you go first on that one?
So again, partly, and this may not answer your question, Paul, I think in some ways, you know, the chickens have come home to roost for us in terms of our Christian theologies, because we have often, you know, we talk about community, but we actually encourage people to bowl alone, right? That there's a sense in which we've equated attendance to being part of a movement. And so I think part of it is that a clarity of engagement, you know, I think a number of ways, and I don't know if this gets at it, Paul, but I think on one level, we value and we encourage people to be in attendance. And we talk about the others, but we don't really live into and demonstrate how we do relationship building, even within. I remember, for example, when I was at Walmer Road back many moons ago, one of the things we used to do on Sunday mornings, or a couple of Sunday mornings a month, was to have somebody interview a member of the congregation. And I was constantly surprised at how people who had been part of the congregation for 30, 20 years together kept saying, I never knew that about you. Right? And so in some ways, we don't know how to do that kind of relationship building, even when we're together. We have no kind of relationship building outside of the bounds of our communities. And I think we also lose sense of the what for. What do we worship for, right? I mean, I think Jesus, my sense of Jesus is that Jesus calls us to be part of a movement that's about transformation in the world. And it's not something we can do alone. None of us can do that. So I think it's those missing pieces for me that would kind of get at that, and only slightly. And I think there's more nuance than I think I could give, but I think just in a broad stroke, that's what I would offer.
Thank you.
Do you have anything you wanted to add to that, Ken?
Yeah, just a reminder that our economic system drives our cultural intelligence. The message we get is that you're on your own, every man and woman for him or herself. And that is one thing the church has to militantly resist and find ways to be rooted together. In some of the practical things that obviously are going to have to change, our congregation has all bivocational pastors, very part-time. We don't own a building. We rent space from another congregation. And for many, many weeks and months, we have met outside in the parking lot when the weather permitted. So there are all sorts of adjustments that we'll have to make in terms of our expectation of what church is going to look like. And we'll have to do a lot of experimenting, and there will be failures in those experiments, but those are some of the challenges that we're up against, I think.
If I can probably share a quick story. For about 5 years, I worked in Regent Park in Toronto, and those of you who are from Toronto know that Regent Park was known as one of the poorest neighborhood in the city, but also one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. 50% of the community were Muslims, and predominantly from Bangladesh. In terms of doing work in the community, we could find money to do work with women. We couldn't find monies to do work with men. A group of Muslim women came to us and said, you know, there's a huge level of domestic violence in this community, and it's being perpetuated by our men. So it's not us as women that need the support in order to address the issue of domestic violence. We need resources to support our men in this community if we're going to break the cycle of domestic violence. We went out and we found some money from the Trillium Foundation. And I know before folks have a heart attack because there's this notion that Trillium gets its money from lottery. We got money funding from Trillium to do this program, and it's the only place that would give us monies to actually do work with men to break the cycle of domestic violence in the community. A couple of churches who supported the work that I was leading overall heard that we received money from Trillium, and their principle about not taking lottery money led them to say to me that they were withdrawing their funding to the organization, which then put me in a crisis in terms of meeting my obligation as an organization. And it's that kind of disconnect where we forget that part of what we are about is bringing healing and wholeness. And they couldn't hear the fact that if we're going to break the cycle of domestic violence, it had to be focused on men, and we needed to find the resources to work with men, and the only place we could find the resources. But they just went on principle. And I think part of this movement building or understanding what Jesus is calling us to, I think has to do with knowing the communities and the needs in the communities in which we work, and how is the best way to support the kind of wholeness and healing that needs to happen in that community.
Thank you. Thank you. Kathy Park, I see your hand.
Yes, I have a question. To both gentlemen, once we're figuring out how to gather in community, authentic community, I'm wondering about the discerning process. How do we start a discerning process together in community? Some people don't even realize what that is, or that it exists, or that it's a need. And how do we, I don't know, invite people into that? And how do we carry out the discernment process? I would appreciate some input on that. And the discerning process, like, is it through spiritual formation exercises and us seeking God together as a group, and how to listen? Anyway, there you go.
Ken, do you want to start?
Okay. One of the things I have said to my congregation many times over the last 20 years, we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary, is that whether we grow in numbers and dollars is neither here nor there.
That's
there are
right.
too many
Yeah.
things that we do not control.
Yeah.
Whether we articulate our vision with as much intelligence and passion is up to us. And so I believe that if you articulate the passion and intelligence of your vision, you will have what you need. That's just a core commitment. Part of the way we respond to mission in Circle of Mercy is we use what's called a mission group strategy that depends on the initiative of someone in the congregation saying, I want to work with this on this issue, with this group on this problem. Who wants to join with me? And groups grow up organically to undertake a particular mission at a particular time. Sometimes it's a long term, sometimes it's short term, but there's a lot of encouragement that your pastors are not your managers. That initiative needs to come from the ground up, and it may involve something. We have different volunteers who do a Lenten group every year and an Advent group. We've had volunteers doing a special storytelling time with our children. And so a lot of it, when you want to have a small administrative footprint, getting the congregation to understand that they primarily are the originators of new ideas, new agreements, new tasks to perform, new studies to engage in.
I think to that, I would add, one of the things that, as Leanne mentioned, we in the United Church have just articulated a mission and vision for the church, and the mission is deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. And in some ways, we see that as a bit of a cycle that deepening our spirituality leads us into a clearer understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, which moves us into areas of justice, but the areas of justice push us back into deep spirituality. So it's a bit of a cycle in terms of thinking about our life together as a church. But I would offer this as well. I think our health as Canadians, but as people, church people in Canada, I'm going to be risky here and say I think until we all engage around what our religious ancestors have created and done to the indigenous peoples of this land, there is no healing or wholeness for us. And I think part of the discernment that we need to be engaged in is we need to be discerning and building relationship with the indigenous communities, not a sense of feeling sorry for them. There's a lot of pain and trauma and hurt in that community. But folks, the reality is that our previous generations who saw these people as non-people, as they sought to Christianize the nation, have done a huge injustice, and it comes back. You know, the thing I'm aware of is that the discovery of the graves, and where Justice Murray Sinclair can say the churches, and not make a distinction currently about which church is responsible, but the reality that the churches bear some responsibility for the genocide that happened to the indigenous peoples of this land means that it's not only those of us like the United Church who ran the schools on behalf of the government. It's all of us who have the title church in our name. The larger society is saying, why would I want to be part of something that has perpetuated the level of genocide and cruelty that has happened to the indigenous people of our land? And part of the discernment is that we need to be reading, we need to be in relationship. And I think as we engage that, we'll begin to see some of where God is at work in our society. I think as Canadians, we cannot, right? And I mean, the second piece is that it's our forebears who also deemed the transatlantic slave trade to be okay. And so, you know, there's some significant things in our lives today that we need to be engaging about, because that's the only way we're going to find a bit of liberation and wholeness among our lives. And we can't keep ignoring it.
Thank you. That's a topic I could get carried away with, but I'll try and control myself. But I totally agree with you, Michael. Prue Watt.
Yes, Michael and Ken, do you have any suggestions on how we can get more involved with some of the different cultures that are in our community? I've been doing a lot of reading and have looked at the Indigenous problems and issues and suggestions. And a few of them I can do, but getting to know the people involved is a challenge that I haven't come up with any good ideas as to how to do this.
So I think there's a couple of things. And Prue, are you in the Toronto area? You're muted.
In the Peterborough area.
Okay, so one of the things is that most communities have a Native Canadian center. There's a center where Indigenous folks gather, and I think one of the places about that is to just say, look, to go and say, you know, I'm on this journey. Help me understand what I don't understand. And I think in some ways it's putting ourselves at risk and being vulnerable to learn and be taught. And I think, you know, right now, a lot of the communities are hurting because of the graves, but I think my sense is there's still this sense of generosity and hospitality. So it's a perspective of saying, I don't know what I don't know. Help me to understand what I need to know. And I think whatever the community is, whether it's people of African descent, the indigenous peoples, the LGBT groups, trans group, I think it's a perspective of I need to learn. Can you accompany me in that learning? I'll do my work, but I just need to know what I don't know. And I think it's that risk taking of building relationship that I think is part of where it begins.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Ken?
Oh, no, that's exactly right. And here in the US, our racial problem is, history is much more focused on African Americans than indigenous people, but we have the same things in several parts of the US. But that willingness to reach out and to risk letting people know that we don't know what we don't know, that is the step of humility, is the entry point in which we make connections with people who are not like us. And slowly our hearts begin to expand and we can take in more and more. And then we can pull our communities along with us from time to time.
Thank you. Now, Prue, can you lower your hand? And
Yes.
then Shirley Copeland, you have your hand up. You need to unmute yourself, Shirley.
I live in Brantford, which is near Six Nations, and through the United Church, I joined a program that helped me learn about Native people and the things that they have gone through. They discussed treaties and residential school and all the things that are sort of important there. And we meet on the reserve, but we don't necessarily mix. And but I find out all of the stumbling blocks and the things we could do wrong. That's a good thing. And anyway, you have in Peterborough, you have lots of reserves around there, and so check with them and see if there's anything going on, or check with United Churches that are nearby.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any other hands raised at this moment.
I always hate to cut off meaningful conversation, Karen, but I am aware that it's getting to be that time. So maybe I will step in if I may.
You certainly may.
Thank you for your leadership. On behalf of our program committee, Michael and Ken, we want to thank you for sharing your time, your wisdom, your insight, most especially for sharing yourselves with us today. It's been wonderful to have this time together. Michael, your criticisms of the church that I serve sting, and because they hit home, but at the same time, I hear them coming from someone who also loves the church. And so I find hope and encouragement in those criticisms as well. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And Ken, you, with your prophecy and your poetry, you've held us close today and provoked joy in us as well. And so thank you to you too for the leadership that you've brought to these important conversations. This is the part, where if we were all together, we would bring you up on the stage and we would shake your hand and we would slip a little envelope in your hand and say, thank you. Here's something tangible. So we'll do that electronically, but see that happening in this moment. Something tangible as an expression of our gratitude and our appreciation to both of you. Thank you.
It really is a privilege for me. And even a special delight for seeing some faces I have not seen in a long time. So thank you.
Mm.
And
Dave,
thanks for the privilege of being with you again. It's been a long time. I still consider you Baptist folks family, even though I'm in a different tribe at the moment. So it's been great, and I feel privileged for the opportunity to be able to share with you.
Dave, may I add one small thing? When I think of the richness of this conversation, I'm wondering, maybe it's something for the business meeting, but just to say, what next? 6 months from now till our next gathering is not soon enough. And so often we get presented with, all of this that has been revealed, and then it's sort of, now what? I would love to be a part of a conversation circle from this group and beyond, where we talk about what are the little bits and pieces. So often what needs to be done, or the problem, quote unquote, seems so large. And where do I begin? What are the little things, little pieces, how to do hybrid in a way that makes sense, and also rethink how we operate in those church buildings. Like for me, I like to wander around, and it's a pain in the neck for those on the Zoom operators who have to follow me around or something like that. So where do we begin? So just throwing it out there, and maybe we could start an email group and see if anybody's interested to do this by Zoom.
Thank you, Leanne. I can't speak for the whole organization, obviously, but from the program committee's perspective, I think I could really get on board with the model that Ken shared, where that he used in their congregational setting, where when someone cares deeply about something, such as yourself, that we provide an opportunity for others to gather with you and gather around you and work with you on that. So we'll talk some more along the way.
And I think this is just another one of the examples of the gift to which Michael referred, that this is not something I would suggest if we were all in person, but because of Zoom, I think we can do that.
Thank you, Leanne. Just before we move on to the next part of our day here, I want to say, I've said thank you to Michael and Ken, but I want to thank all of you who have joined in our event today. We've been really gratified by the number of people who've been able to join us for our gatherings in this last year or so. One of the pluses of the pandemic has been that we've learned to communicate a little differently and gather differently. And as a result, we've been able to reach out and include others in that gathering. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Blake and Rita and Leanne and Karen, who have given leadership online today. Thank you to the small group facilitators. When I reached out to folk who were attending and asked if some would take that role on, everyone said yes. So thank you for your enthusiastic support and your leadership in those important small group settings. I want to say thank you to my wife, Kim, who is our registrar. Kim was planning to be with us today, but our son, who sings in a choir with Wilfrid Laurier University, suddenly announced that they were having their first concert in almost 2 years today. And so Kim sends her regrets for not being able to be here, but she's enjoyed communicating with many of you and being our registrar. So thank you to her for that work. And before I hand things over to our moderator, to Blake, I just want to say that we as an organization in the gathering are struggling to be organized, I guess. We've never really thought of ourselves as an organization in the past. We've thought of ourselves as an informal group of people that just like getting out, getting together with one another. But we're learning that we have to be more organized in certain ways in order to provide the kind of support that we've been able to offer to some, in particular to some of our clergy who have been credentialed by us. And also, it takes some organization in order to foster relationships with others, like the Canadian Association for Baptist Freedoms, the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, and other groups as well. Part of my hope and yearning still is that we will find ways to create a more national and even international association and partnerships. So we look forward to your participation in order to do that as members of our group, as member churches in the gathering, and in particular as volunteers who would serve in leadership on our program committee, on our membership committee, on our board, on any ways that you see that you could contribute. We have important items of business to transact, and so I'm going to move us along to that now. But may I just encourage you all to stay. This will give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about who we are, and perhaps to discover ways in which you could be involved with us. I will call on our moderator, Blake Eady, at this time to convene our meeting as soon as I can find him in my list of participants here again. Yeah, and I know you're going to help me with this too.